Hello everyone, Reza here. In this video, I will show how we can query the Graph API using standard connectors directly from PowerApps. The Graph API is the one endpoint that we can query to get our enterprise data. Calling the Graph API directly from PowerApps opens up a world of possibilities. The best part is that PowerApps now understands the response that the Graph API sends back. So let's check this out in action. The Microsoft Graph API is a single endpoint that we can leverage to access and interact with Microsoft 365 services and data. The Graph Explorer is a great tool that we can leverage to access the various endpoints that are provided for us. For example, get my profile. If I click Run Query, this will provide a JSON response with my profile details. Note I have signed in to my organization's account in the Graph Explorer, and hence I see all my details based upon my account. In PowerApps, to make a call to the Graph API, you can go to Data Sources, search for Office 365 groups, and connect to it. I will insert a button control. So on click of this button, I will go ahead and make a call to this Graph API endpoint to get my profile details. This is a GET request, and it does not have any request body. So I will copy this, and in my Power App, on select of this button, I will use Office 365 groups dot HTTP request. Here we can call the Graph API endpoint. So I'll put the Graph API endpoint that I would like to call. Next property is the method, in this case is a GET request. And the third property is a data type file, that's the request body. In this case it is empty, so I'll simply pass an empty string. The response that I get, I will store it in a variable. And now if I go ahead and click on this button, it will go ahead and call that Graph API endpoint. And the response will be stored in the variable. Now previously, this response that we would receive in PowerApps would always be a Boolean data type. PowerApps did not understand the response that was received. But now, this data type has changed to Untyped Object. One of my MVP friends, Hiro, noticed about this recent change, and he has a blog post which highlights the fact that we can get information back from Graph API in a format called Untyped Object. And the key update that provides this response type is under Settings, Upcoming Features, Preview, Parse JSON function and untyped objects that needs to be turned on. Now the response that I get is in JSON format. PowerApps though understands it in the format of an untyped object, which we have to traverse through in order to get the details. Now to confirm that this untyped object actually holds the JSON response from the Graph API, under Advanced Tools, we have a tool called Monitor. I'll go ahead and open Monitor, and this will now get connected to my studio session. I will click this button, which will once again go ahead and make that Graph API call. Now if I go to Monitor, there is a network request, HTTP request, which is using the Office 365 groups endpoint. If I select this, I have the details, I have the request, and has the response. The response body is that JSON response that has my profile information. And that's that untyped object. Now, if I need the display name from the response, here in my Power App, I will add a label to show the display name. The text property for this, I will use my variable, which is where my profile, which is an untyped object, dot display name. And that goes ahead and grabs the value. Let's pick job title. This will be where my profile dot job title. So as you can see, I can easily get the data from that untyped object. Get my profile details is something that is already available in PowerApps. We have a connector called Office 365 Users that can give me my profile details. So I would recommend to first explore if there is a connector that already exposes those details for us. If no, then we can take advantage of the Graph API. Let's just say I call an endpoint called test. If I run this, if I look at where my profile, notice it gives me an error message. And it says that only specific endpoints are supported, like me, which gives you all your details, your profile, your files. You can get information related to users, Office 365 groups, sites, SharePoint, OneDrive, the search endpoint, planner, Teams, chat. So there are quite a few useful endpoints that we can take advantage of. In Graph Explorer, here we have Microsoft Teams, and one of the actions is My Joined Teams. If I run this, it will provide a response which has a property called value. It's an array, and it has details about the teams that I have joined. So let's call this endpoint from PowerApps. I'll store this response in a variable called where_my_teams. Monitor, I have monitor running. I'll click the button. It will call the Graph API endpoint. Here's the success. Let's go straight to the response, and you can see the response body has tabular data, which has all the details about the teams that I have joined. I can even change this to JSON tree to look at the JSON response that I have received. The untyped object begins from the body attribute. Now in this, there is a property called value that's an array that holds the information about all the teams that I am a part of. Now since it's an array, I will leverage a gallery to list out all the teams. For the items property of the gallery, I will use the variable where_my_teams dot value. Now value is an array, so it's still an untyped object, but I know it has tabular data, so I will typecast this to a table. The value, which are these objects which has the team details, is also JSON data, and from there I want the display name of the team. In my gallery, I have this title label, so I will use this item dot value dot my property, which is display name. And we can see how it's listing out all the team names that I am a part of. If I need any other property, like the description, here I have another label called subtitle, so I'll use this item dot value dot description. And here is a list of all the teams that I am a member of. If you want a list of all the endpoints that are available as part of Graph API, simply select Microsoft Graph API reference documents, And this will lead us to the documentation that has information about all the different endpoints that we can call. Remember, we are limited to those certain endpoints from the Office 365 Groups action. We have an option here, Sites and Lists. And if I go to Site, there is one endpoint called Get Lists. And this will list out all the lists and libraries that are a part of your SharePoint site. It's a GET request. All it requires is the site ID. In Graph Explorer, if we go to SharePoint Sites, search for a SharePoint site by keyword. It calls an endpoint and also passes a keyword to search on. If I run this, it will search for sites based on the search parameter that I provided. So I can use this endpoint in PowerApps and dynamically read the search parameter from the user. I'll copy this endpoint, go back to PowerApps. I have a text input control and I have a button to search sites. When this button is clicked, I will call that endpoint. The search text is hard-coded. I will change this, ampersand, my text input control dot text. My variable, I'll call it var sites. The response is once again an array. I would like to show the name of the site. So let's make a test. I'll search for Contoso, click search sites. This will have my variable loaded with that untyped object. I'll add a gallery because I get an array response from this graph endpoint. So for the items property, I'll use that variable var sites dot value. So I will typecast this to a table. For the title label control, so this item dot value dot name. And I will also show the description. So this item dot value dot description. So these are the SharePoint sites that it's searching for in my tenant. I have an icon control here. I will change this to link. And when this is selected, I'll use launch. What's the address? Here, I have a property called web URL that gives me the URL of the SharePoint site. This item dot value dot web URL. Do not want to pass any parameters and launch this in a new tab. Let's preview. I select this, takes me to the SharePoint site. And this is completely dynamic. Let's search for 365. I have a couple of SharePoint sites where the title or description contains 365. And this will take me to those SharePoint sites. Now notice, in here, I also get the ID of the SharePoint site. We also have another endpoint that gives us the details of all the lists in a SharePoint site. So I'll copy this, paste it in Graph API Explorer, just the endpoint. Site ID token. This, I will replace it with the ID of this SharePoint site. And if I run the query, it will give me all the lists and libraries that are a part of that SharePoint site. Here I have the list of SharePoint sites. Now when any item in this gallery is selected, so the gallery has an onSelect property, here I will set another variable. I'll call it var lists. I will call Office 365 groups.http request my endpoint. I'll put my endpoint. This is a GET request. And I'll close my function. For site ID, here I'll make this dynamic. I will use this item dot value dot, the property is called ID dot ID. So this will give me all the lists. So if I select, you'll see var lists is an untyped object. Let's add another gallery now. to show the list details. And for this gallery, the items will be where lists dot value typecasted to a table. To know the response of that untyped object, you can check in Graph Explorer or look at the documentation that gives you details, or you can also leverage monitor. So notice value is array. In there, I want the name. So this item dot value dot name. And then for the subtitle label, I would like to show whether it's a list or a library. So we have a property called template that gives that information. Now notice in the main object, there is a property called list, and in that there is a property called template, traversing through JSON. So this item dot value dot list dot template. These are case sensitive. Let's preview the app. So for my RD Tech SharePoint site, these are the lists and libraries. Let's change the search. For Contoso, these are my lists and libraries. For PowerHR, these are the lists and libraries. And now to tie it up in a real world use case, I have a Power App that showcases details from a SharePoint list called tasks. On the left hand side, it lists out all the task names and who the task is assigned to. For the selected task, I have a form where I can update the properties of the task. And then on the right hand side, I'm actually showcasing the version history of the items of that SharePoint site directly in PowerApps without calling any flow. I am simply using Graph API. So when I select a specific item, I can see all its versions. The progress of this item is behind, but previously it was in progress. That is version 11. Here's version 10. Here's version 9. Let's make a change to this item. I'll edit. I'll change the status of this task to completed and submit. The moment I do that, it pops in another version. So the previous version of the item had the progress as behind, but now the progress is completed. And how was this possible? When I select a specific item in this gallery, I am leveraging the Graph API endpoint to get the versions of an item. Here's my Graph API endpoint, my site ID, my list ID, items / the ID of the item, which I already have in this gallery that is connected to that list, / versions. And from versions, go and get me 3 columns from my list: title, progress, and priority. My gallery for versions is that variable.value typecasted to a table. And then right here at the bottom, I'm showing the details based upon the selected item of the gallery. Gallery.selected.value, the JSON that gets returned, has a property fields. Within it, I have my column values. So I'm just simply traversing through the JSON to show those values. Let's take another example. For a specific task, I can assign the task to users. Now this assigned to is a person type column in my SharePoint list. However, here it only allows you to select 2 users. So it's actually loading users in that combo box option based upon users who are owners of an Office 365 group. On the on start of this Power App, I am making a call to a Graph API endpoint. Groups / the ID of the group / owners. Let's run monitor for this Power App. And let's run app on start. So here's the HTTP request. Here is the response. This group has 2 owners. If I go to JSON tree, I can see the response value. And I wanted to load all that information in a collection. So I looped through all the items in the value property of the JSON response, which is the array. And from there, I grabbed the display name of the user and the user principal name, and I've placed that in a collection. So if we explore the collection, these are the two users who are the owners of this Office 365 group. And this is a group called cat team. All I needed is the ID. It has two owners. Let's add a third owner, James. Back to my Power App. If I run this, notice James also gets added to that collection. And that collection is what I'm binding to this combo box. So now I can assign this task to any of those owners and no other users. Let's assign it to James. The task is assigned to James. A new version gets created. And you are not just limited to GET requests. Here is a scenario where I would like to upload a document to a SharePoint library, even inside folders. There is no action in PowerApps that can directly do that. We typically have to leverage Power Automate to do that. I'll click upload, upload a file, and when I click upload, this is where I will post all the files in this attachments control to my SharePoint library. Once again, I'm leveraging Graph API. I have done a video on this, so I'll link it in the description for this video. This time, it's a put request since I'm putting a file. This requires a data type file. In this case, these attachments are files, so it's easy for me to post this by simply pointing to it. So if I click upload, this will upload this file to SharePoint, and here is the latest file. And I can also do this within folders. Let's try and upload a file directly to a folder. And there is my file. One scenario that comes to top of my mind, I have a SharePoint list that has thousands of items. The number one challenge in PowerApps is searching. We run into delegation issues. I'll search for tax. This is now performing a search query against that entire SharePoint list. I have items with same names, so I've actually printed the item IDs as well to prove that these are separate items. Let's search for videos. And those are my results. This call to get the data is not easy. The reason is because the post request in PowerApps requires to pass a file. Now, how do I pass a file property where in this scenario, I'm actually just putting data in a text box? I'll show you that in a future video. If you enjoyed this video, then do like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And thank you so much for watching.